Hello and welcome to session 1.1 of Jesus and the Magic Money Tree. I'm John Daniels. Jesus and the Magic Money Tree is a chance to make crucial links between ecology, economics, and what Christians believe at a time of unsettling change. Although it's informed by a Christian perspective, it's for anyone who wants to get a better handle on what really makes today's world go round, and are up for doing some serious thinking along the way. The course is divided into 3 parts, each made up of 5 sessions. You can find out more about these and access supporting materials by following the link at the top of the screen. Do visit this web page if you haven't already. This first part is all about money and how our money system works. We'll be looking into what money is, where it comes from, how well off we can get, and how it's all based on faith. And it's on that note that we kick off part 1 by asking, what is faith? How would you answer that question, I wonder? Here is a range of words, all of which are sometimes linked in one way or another to the idea of faith. If you could rearrange these words and cluster some of them together, how would you do that? What would the rearranged picture look like? Which words would you link closely with faith? Which would be further away? And which wouldn't be anywhere in sight because they have so little in common with faith? Please pause the presentation here for a moment to think about this. I wonder what kind of arrangement you ended up with. Well, let me cut to the chase by offering a simple definition of faith. I want to suggest that faith is best understood as what makes knowledge and action possible. Now, that might strike you as a surprising definition, so I need to start by acknowledging a couple of other very different understandings of faith that have been doing the rounds. First sees faith as standing in opposition to knowledge. This outlook goes back at least as far as René Descartes, the celebrated French philosopher and arguably patron saint of modernity. If you know nothing else about him, you'll know that Descartes once wrote somewhere, "I think, therefore I am." He was trying to decide what could be known with certainty, and so he set about systematically doubting everything he could. As a result, the whole world of experience as an object of secure knowledge faded away, and all he was left with was himself as a thinking, doubting being. In the very act of doubting, his existence as a thinking being could not be denied. Hence, I think, therefore I am. But what matters for us here is that this was an attempt to bypass faith altogether in order to secure knowledge, and more specifically, knowledge as certitude, the conviction of absolute certainty, that which could not conceivably be doubted. If you have a method which provides you with that, well then, faith begins to look rather surplus to requirements. The gulf between faith and knowledge, which Descartes did so much to create, has been quarried still further by some famous contemporary atheists. Take Richard Dawkins, for example. Faith, he says, is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. For him, and many others, faith stands in complete opposition to knowledge. Like oil and water, they just can't mix. If modern atheists commonly oppose faith with knowledge, Some strands of Protestant Christianity are prone to oppose faith with action. And this all goes back to the Reformation, of course, and to the experiences, not least, of one Martin Luther. Luther, pious Augustinian friar, came to despair of his traditional spiritual practices, that they could ever succeed in making him right with God. All our efforts can never achieve that, he concluded. Only faith in what God has achieved on our behalf in Christ can reconcile us to God. Our actions, or good works, can perhaps be seen as evidence that we've already been put right by faith, but they could never bring about that reconciliation by themselves. Here too, we see a gulf opening up, this time between faith and action. Having hopefully named the elephants in the room, let me repeat the counter-definition I offered earlier. Faith is what makes knowledge and action possible. Or you could say, faith is about how you join the dots. What do you reckon this is a picture of? Well, I did mention elephants, didn't I? So this is an easy one to start with. But how about this one? What's this a picture of? What shapes can you make out here? You might want to pause the presentation for a moment to examine the picture before continuing. That's right, two penguins having a tete-a-tete. Not so obvious, was it? I'd guessed a butterfly before I got my pencil out to join the dots. When you think about it, all join the dots puzzles have two things in common. First, a non-random distribution of dots. They tend to be clustered in particular places, don't they? And not in others. And secondly, the numbers, of course, which act as a kind of set of instructions telling you in which order the dots should be joined. So, what do you make of this one? What's this a picture of? Well, the answer, of course, is nothing, or equally, anything. There's a complete ambiguity to this even unnumbered distribution of dots, isn't there? No clustering, no numbers to give us a clue. And, as the preacher once said, life can sometimes seem a bit like this, can't it? The shapes, the meanings which we tend to take for granted can sometimes disappear. All it takes is a bereavement, a divorce, a redundancy. Life is ambiguous. What you see, and so what you know and how you act, depend on how you join the dots. What kind of a pattern you make out. Can you see the Dalmatian in this picture? In three-quarter view, pointing away from us, nose to the ground in the leaf litter? If you stare at it for long enough, hopefully you will. So this is an example of a gestalt, an organized whole which is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. As human beings, we're predisposed to seeing patterns, organized wholes, amid the jumble of bits and pieces that make up the world. Here are a few more for you, more ambiguous this time. Can you see the old lady in a shawl with a prominent nose and chin? And can you also see the demure young woman in three-quarter view facing away from us? A button nose just visible there on the left, and her earlobe peeping out from beneath her hair. And you see the saxophonist Can you also see the face of the young woman? And what about this image? Imagine that you're walking across a park of a dark winter's evening. There's no one around until you notice this figure standing on the path up ahead. What would you do? Would you stride on confidently? Might you find yourself gripping your umbrella harder than usual, perhaps? Or might you be inclined to turn on your heel and take the long way around on the main road instead? What you do will depend on what you see, how you join the dots, which gestalt you register. He, after all, could turn out to be a she, a pillar of the local church youth group. Or, equally, he could be carrying a knife. And if you'd be inclined to take the long way around along the main road, you wouldn't be alone. 47% of those over 75 and 37% of those over 50 no longer take part in community activities after dark because of fear of street crime. So, what is life as a whole a picture of? Remember, I've suggested that faith is actually a way of noticing particular kinds of patterns, a particular kind of gestalt. So, what kinds of patterns might a Christian make out? Well, that's a big question, isn't it? But here are a couple of examples of the shift in Gestalt which we find in the Bible, the particular way of joining the dots which Christian faith proposes. First of all, we've got these well-known words from Isaiah, often read on Good Friday because of their extraordinary resonance with the experience of the crucified Christ. But notice the shift in Gestalt here. He had no dignity or beauty to make us take notice of him. We ignored him as if he were nothing. And yet, he endured the suffering that should have been ours. We're healed by the punishment he received, made whole by the blows he endured. What had looked like a despised criminal now appears from a different angle as the Saviour of the world. And how about the Beatitudes, part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount? Notice again the reversals of meaning which happen if we allow Jesus to join the dots for us. Happy are those who are hungry and thirsty for goodness, for they will be satisfied. Happy are those who have suffered persecution for the cause of goodness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. What you see, and so what you know and how you act, depend on how you join the dots, on what kind of a pattern you make out. Centuries ago, Anselm of Canterbury saw this clearly. I believe, he said, in order to understand, credo ut intelligam, how to understand the world and how to act in it. Knowledge and action, far from being opposed to faith, wholly depend upon it. What matters is what kind of faith outlook we bring to the business of living. So, in summary, I want to suggest that we think again about the vocabulary of faith. Rather than see faith as at best a second-rate version of knowledge, or action as a cul-de-sac notable only for not leading to God, instead, what if faith, trust, belief, confidence All those things are what make knowledge and action possible. That they are the, as it were, working assumptions for living. Bearing in mind this idea of faith as a set of working assumptions for living, let's touch base with the Bible at this point. This is a fascinating story, which shows the links between faith, knowledge, and action in striking ways. Please read, would you, these extracts from John chapter 9, or the whole chapter if you wish, now, and then have a look at these questions and read the extracts a second time. What working assumptions or faith positions feature in this passage? How are they expressed? Who does the expressing, and with what results? Please pause the presentation now while you do that. So, what did you come up with? Let's look at the characters in the story in turn. First, the disciples. Their initial working assumption was that the man's blindness was a judgment on someone's sin. And that leads them to ask, whose sin? Many cultures and religions have assumed that people's current fortunes are the result of past conduct. But Jesus responds by proposing a completely different gestalt. The man's blindness, for him, presents an occasion for showing what God can do, the radical difference God can make in someone's life. This working assumption leads to action. In fact, a pretty weird set of actions. Jesus spits on the ground, makes a paste of mud, and smears it over the man's eyes. And what the man thought was going on, we're not told. Suffice to say that when Jesus tells him to go and wash it off, he needs no second bidding. But notice that the healing only happened because the man himself then took action by obeying Jesus' instruction. And all this only occurred because of Jesus' original working assumption when he saw the blind man. Next appear the Pharisees. In making the paste, Jesus had done work on the Sabbath. According to the Pharisees' working assumptions, this shows that Jesus doesn't keep the Sabbath and so can't be from God. This piece of knowledge follows directly from their particular faith position. The man's response to all this demonstrates a very different gestalt to that of the Pharisees. When they look at Jesus, they see a sinner, while the healed man, when he looks at Jesus, sees a prophet. This mismatch leads in turn to the Pharisees seeing the man also as a sinner through and through, and so to action. They drive him away. It's only towards the end of the passage, in verse 35, that the language of faith becomes explicit. Do you believe in the Son of Man? And notice the way in which the vocabulary of faith becomes interwoven with that of sight in these final verses, and how these are tied up with ultimate vindication and condemnation. The healed man has seen Jesus, in the sense of having registered a particular gestalt, which issues in faith, in knowledge of Jesus as Son of Man, and in action, specifically here at the end of the passage, in worship. It's interesting, though, that for this man, faith seems to have come as the end product of a process which began with action in obedience to a stranger's command, or arguably which began further back still, with allowing a stranger to do something to him which at the time he could scarcely have understood. Who knows? Perhaps faith always has at its root an openness to receiving unexpected, unlikely, unmerited gifts. One final thought before we draw to a close. What happens, or rather doesn't happen, when faith is lacking? Here's a story about faith set in a wholly non-religious context, one which sets the scene nicely for the following sessions, in which we'll be turning to think about money. It's taken from one of the books on the reading list, which you can find on the website, Stephen D. King's When the Money Runs Out, The End of Western Affluence. King writes, "On a recent trip to Jerusalem, I went on a guided tour to take in the major sights. En route, I passed the hundreds of market stalls that vie for tourist business. My guide was recommending specific stalls to me, suggesting their proprietors could be trusted to give me a good price. What, however, if my guide received a kickback from these proprietors? If so, his recommendations would be less than useless. Yet, if I went to the other stalls not recommended by my guide, he might then take offense. I eventually decided that the simplest thing to do was not to buy anything. Thus, the proprietors lost out, my guide lost out, and I lost out, returning home empty-handed. A lack of trust prevented a transaction from taking place." This was a classic example of market failure. All parties wanted a transaction to take place, but a lack of trust meant that it was impossible to strike a deal. Faith, trust, confidence. They're everywhere, not just in church. The thing is, we often only notice that when they're absent. That is, when what we expect or hope to happen doesn't. To sum up then, Christian faith enables us to join the dots in particular ways, to go about our lives with particular working assumptions. What working assumptions are built into money and how it operates? I'll tune in to session 2 to find out. Join me again for session 2 of Jesus and the Magic Money Tree. Promises, promises. What is money?